In the winter of 1978, our station found a hole in the air, not a door, not light. A shimmer like heat over ice, humming too low to hear. We called Moscow. Moscow said, "Alien." We circled it with lamps and tape. The beam from my flashlight bent when it touched the shimmer, like the world had a soft bruise. Then the clock stuttered and lost a minute. That was when it stepped through. It wore a face the way frost wears glass, clear, thin, always shifting. It smelled like snow and old paper. It said our names in a dozen voices at once, including mine but older. The medic asked what it was. It tilted its head and the room got smaller. The ink in our pens crawled back into the nibs. A soldier whispered his last dream out loud, word for word, like someone was reading him. The thing smiled, and our breath froze mid-air in little bells of ice. "We are not from your stars," it said, gentle as a teacher. "We are what comes after you." But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it really began, 3 weeks before that moment, when I was just Dr. Victor Bowman, geologist, and the worst thing in my life was running out of vodka at the Barrens research station. The call came on a Tuesday. Emergency deployment to coordinates that didn't exist on any map I'd seen, somewhere in the Yamalo-Nenets district where the permafrost runs deeper than God's patience. They needed someone who understood ground-penetrating radar, someone who could keep his mouth shut, and someone stupid enough to fly into the Arctic when the temperature hit -47. I was all three. The helicopter dropped me at a cluster of prefab buildings that looked like dice thrown against the white. No signage, no flags, just generator hums and the kind of cold that makes your molars sing. The commanding officer was a granite block named Captain Dvorak, who shook my hand once and never made eye contact again. "Seismic disturbance," he said, leading me past soldiers who looked like they'd rather be fighting Afghans than babysitting scientists. "Ground shifts, but nothing shows on satellite. Moscow wants answers." The thing was, I'd seen the satellite feeds during the flight briefing. Whatever was happening here left shadows that moved independently of the sun. The pilot had muttered something about compass needles spinning like prayer wheels, but when I asked him to repeat it, he just cranked up the radio. Now, standing in that command tent with frost forming on my breath, I understood why they'd called me. The seismograph readings looked like a heartbeat, too regular, too deliberate. Something underneath the ice was breathing, and it had been doing it for weeks. What we found 3 kilometers north changed everything I thought I knew about time, space, and the terrible mathematics that govern both. The seismograph tent reeked of cigarettes and nervous sweat. Captain Dvorak had assigned me a handler, Sergeant Tommy Briggs from Oklahoma, built like a scarecrow and twice as twitchy. Kid couldn't have been more than 22, but he handled the technical equipment like he'd been born with circuit boards for fingers. "Doc, you gotta see this shit," Briggs said, not looking up from the monitor display. His accent made every word sound like an apology. "Been recording for 6 hours straight. Same pattern every damn time." I leaned over his shoulder, studying the readout. The seismic traces looked organic, rhythmic pulses that rose and fell with mathematical precision. Heartbeat was the wrong word. This was more like breathing, if breathing could shake bedrock 3 kilometers down. "Depth?" I asked. "That's the weird part. Sensors say it's coming from everywhere at once, surface to core, like the whole ground is." He paused, searching for words. "Like it's alive or something." The base itself squatted on a patch of cleared permafrost, ringed by halogen floods that turned the surrounding tundra into a theatre of long shadows. 12 prefab structures connected by insulated walkways, plus the drilling platform that had been hastily erected over what the initial survey team called the source. Everything looked temporary, like they expected to pack up and leave before the spring thaw. "How long you been stationed here?" I asked Briggs while calibrating the ground-penetrating radar unit. 3 weeks. Came in right after the first survey team went radio silent. He lit another cigarette with shaking fingers. "Found their camp intact, equipment running, coffee still..." He stopped himself. "Point is, nobody knows where they went. 12 men vanished like smoke." That detail hadn't been in my briefing packet. I made a mental note to ask Dvorak about it later, though something told me the captain wouldn't be forthcoming with information. The radar unit hummed to life, painting the subterranean landscape in false color relief. What I saw made me blink hard and check the calibration twice. The underground structure extended in perfect geometric patterns, too perfect. Chambers and corridors that formed impossible angles, connected by passages that seemed to fold back on themselves. "Jesus," Briggs whispered, peering at the display. "What the hell built that?" "Nothing built it," I said, tracing the patterns with my finger. "This is natural formation, just organized in ways that don't make sense." But even as I said it, I knew I was lying to both of us. The structure below had architecture, alien, yes, but undeniably purposeful. Rooms arranged in spirals that followed mathematical sequences I recognized from doctoral studies in crystalline lattice theory. Someone, or something, had designed this place. The first tremor hit while we were taking measurements. It wasn't violent, just a gentle rolling motion that made the equipment cases slide a few inches across the floor. But the seismograph went berserk, needle dancing like it was having a seizure. The electrical hum from the generators shifted pitch, climbing higher until it became a whine that made my jaw ache. "Cut the power to non-essential systems," I told Briggs, but he was already reaching for the circuit breakers. That's when we heard the sound. It came from below, muffled by layers of ice and stone, but unmistakably vocal. Not human vocal, something else entirely. Like whale song played through a broken speaker, harmonics that seemed to bypass the ears and vibrate directly in the bones. The sound rose and fell in patterns that matched the seismic readings exactly. "Recording equipment," I snapped. "Now." Briggs fumbled with the audio gear, hands shaking worse than before. The sound continued for maybe 30 seconds, then cut off abruptly. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own pulse hammering against my eardrums. "Doc," Briggs said quietly. "That sounded like it was trying to communicate." Before I could respond, Captain Dvorak burst through the tent flap, face grim as Winterstone. Behind him came two soldiers I hadn't met, Corporal Hayes, a compact man with intelligent eyes, and Private Kowalski, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. "What's your assessment?" Dvorak demanded without preamble. I gestured at the radar display, still showing those impossible geometric patterns. "Whatever's down there, it's not geological. The structure shows clear signs of design, and we just recorded what sounds like attempted communication. I recommend we halt all operations until—" "Negative." Dvorak's tone brooked no argument. "Moscow wants us to proceed with the deep core sampling. We start drilling tomorrow at 0600. Sir, with respect, drilling into an unknown structure could be catastrophically dangerous. If there's some kind of pressure differential, or if the formations are unstable. Doctor, your job is to provide technical expertise, not strategic recommendations." Dvorak moved closer, and I caught the scent of fear sweat beneath his cologne. "The drilling proceeds on schedule. That's an order." After he left, Briggs and I sat in uncomfortable silence. The seismograph had returned to its regular rhythm, but the sound, that haunting, impossible song, echoed in my memory. "Hey Doc," Briggs said finally. "The first survey team, before they disappeared, they left behind some notes, unofficial stuff, personal observations." He pulled out a crumpled notebook, pages yellowed at the edges. The handwriting was cramped, desperate. "Day 12, Briggs read aloud. "The breathing is getting stronger. Johnson swears he heard voices last night speaking in reverse. We found ice formations that shouldn't exist, perfect spirals, like frozen mathematics. Whatever's down there, it's been waiting. God help us. I think it knows we're here." I stared at the notebook, understanding with cold certainty that we were about to make the same mistake as the team before us. Drilling was scheduled to begin in 8 hours. Dawn came like a knife slash across the horizon, painting the permafrost in shades of blood and copper. The drilling rig had been assembled overnight, a massive contraption of steel and hydraulics that looked capable of boring through the Earth's skull. I stood watching the crew make final preparations, nursing black coffee that tasted like motor oil and regret. "Impressive setup," I said to Hayes, who'd been assigned as my morning babysitter. The corporal had the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen action in places that didn't appear on maps. Borrowed from the Cola project, he replied, checking his rifle for the third time in 10 minutes. Same drill heads they used to punch 12 kilometers down. Command wants this done fast and deep. The Cola super deep borehole. I knew the project. Soviet scientists had drilled deeper into the earth than anyone before or since, until they'd hit formations that screamed when the bit touched them. Officially, they'd stopped due to equipment failure. Unofficially, the stories that leaked out spoke of sounds recorded at depth that drove listening technicians to nervous breakdowns. How deep are we going? I asked. Hayes shrugged. Until we hit bottom, I guess. The drill operator was a grizzled Ukrainian named Petrov, who spoke 3 languages and cursed in all of them. He'd arrived on the supply helicopter at 0400, looking like he hadn't slept since the Brezhnev era. When I introduced myself, he laughed bitterly. American geologist, yes? You think you understand the deep earth? He spat into the snow. Earth has secrets, boy. Some secrets bite back. At precisely 600 hours, Captain Dvorak gave the signal. The diesel generators roared to life, and the drill head began its descent into the permafrost. The sound was tremendous, a grinding, shrieking cacophony that sent ravens exploding from their roosts kilometers away. For the first hour, everything proceeded normally. The drill chewed through frozen soil, then bedrock, sending up samples that looked exactly like what you'd expect from the Siberian tundra. Petrov monitored depth readings while I analyzed core samples, finding nothing more exotic than compressed organic matter and mineral deposits. Then we hit the first chamber. The drill head dropped suddenly, like punching through eggshell. Petrov cursed and throttled back the engines, but not before the bit had fallen nearly 3 meters into empty space. The samples that came up were different, crystalline formations that didn't match any geological classification I knew. What the fuck? Briggs whispered, examining one of the specimens under a portable microscope. Doc, these crystals, they're arranged in perfect mathematical spirals. I took a look. He was right. The formations followed Fibonacci sequences with disturbing precision, each crystal face reflecting light in patterns that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. More concerning was their temperature. Despite being pulled from deep underground, they radiated cold that made frost form on the metal tray. How deep are we now? I asked Petrov. 2.7 kilometers, but the chamber. He frowned at his instruments. Sensors show it extends much further than our readings suggested. Maybe 10 times larger than surface scans indicated. That was impossible. The ground-penetrating radar had limitations, but not to that degree. Something was interfering with our measurements, bending electromagnetic waves in ways that violated basic physics. The second chamber came at 3 kilometers exactly. This time, the drill head didn't just drop, it was pulled. The cable tension jumped from normal resistance to nearly snapping in less than a second. Petrov fought the controls as hydraulic systems screamed in protest. Cut power, I shouted, but the Ukrainian was already reaching for the emergency stops. Too late. Something grabbed the drill bit and yanked with force that shouldn't have existed. The steel cable snapped like fishing line, and $50,000 worth of equipment disappeared into the earth with a sound like wind chimes made of bones. In the sudden silence, we could hear something rising from the hole. Not the drill bit returning, something else entirely. A susurrus of movement, like fabric being dragged across stone, growing louder with each passing second. The borehole began to emit a faint phosphorescent glow that pulsed in rhythm with the seismic readings. Jesus Christ, Hayes muttered, raising his rifle toward the hole. Something's coming up. But nothing emerged. Instead, the air around the borehole began to shimmer, not with heat, but with something that made my vision blur at the edges. The generators stuttered and died, leaving us in Arctic quiet broken only by that ascending rustle of movement. Briggs was the first to notice the ice formations. They appeared around the borehole's rim like time-lapse flowers blooming, spiraling upward in perfect mathematical curves. But these weren't normal ice crystals. They glowed with the same phosphorescence as the hole, and they grew against gravity, reaching toward the sky with architectural precision. "Doc," Briggs said, voice tight with controlled panic. "The ice, it's forming words." I moved closer, studying the crystalline growths. He was right. The spiraling formations, when viewed from the correct angle, resolved into symbols that looked almost like writing. Not human writing, something older, more fundamental. Mathematical equations rendered in frozen water, expressing concepts my mind couldn't quite grasp. "Everybody back up," Hayes ordered, gesturing with his rifle. "Now!" The ground began to shake again, but not with the regular breathing rhythm we'd recorded before. This was different, arrhythmic, excited, like whatever was down there had suddenly awakened to our presence. The seismograph in the nearby tent went wild, needle dancing across measurements that exceeded the instrument's capacity. Captain Dvorak appeared at my shoulder, face grim as a funeral director. "Report." "We've lost the drill head and established contact with chambers that exceed our measurement capabilities. The formations we're seeing suggest..." "Suggestions don't interest me, Doctor. Facts." I gestured at the growing ice formations, now reaching nearly 2 meters in height and continuing to expand. "Fact. Those crystals are forming against thermodynamics and gravity. Fact. They're arranged in patterns that suggest mathematical intelligence. Fact. Whatever we've awakened down there is responding to our intrusion." Dvorak studied the phosphorescent spirals, jaw working like he was chewing glass. "Recommendations? Evacuate the site, seal the borehole with concrete, recommend the area for permanent quarantine." I met his eyes. "Sir, this is beyond our capabilities to contain or understand." "Negative." His response was immediate, final. "Moscow has investment in this operation. We proceed with secondary drilling tomorrow at 0800. "Secondary drilling?" Briggs squeaked. "Sir, with respect, we just lost 50 grand worth of equipment to something that defies..." "The operation continues, Sergeant." Dvorak's tone could have flash-frozen vodka. "Dr. Bowman, I want detailed analysis of those formations by morning. Full spectroscopic breakdown, chemical composition, structural mathematics. Everything." After he left, we stood in uncomfortable silence, watching the ice spirals continue their impossible growth. The phosphorescence had spread to encompass the entire drill site, casting everything in an otherworldly blue-green glow that made shadows behave strangely. "Doc," Petrov said quietly, "in Ukraine, we have stories about places where the earth bleeds light. Old stories, from before the Soviets. They say such places are doorways, not for travel, but for things that should stay buried." As if responding to his words, the susurrus from below grew louder, more insistent, and mixed within that sound of fabric and stone, I could swear I heard voices whispering in languages that predated human speech. Hayes was checking his radio, trying to raise the communications tent. "Comms are down," he reported, "all frequencies showing interference." The implications settled over me like a burial shroud. We were isolated, 3 kilometers from the nearest settlement, with something awakening beneath our feet that could manipulate matter at the molecular level. The previous survey team's disappearance suddenly seemed less mysterious and more inevitable. That night, as I worked on the crystalline analysis Dvorak had demanded, I found something that made my blood freeze harder than the Siberian wind. The mathematical sequences encoded in the ice formations weren't random. They were countdown markers, decreasing with each new spiral that formed. And if my calculations were correct, they would reach 0 in approximately 18 hours, exactly when the secondary drilling was scheduled to begin. The countdown in the ice reached 7 hours when Private Kowalski started speaking backwards. It began during the night shift while he was monitoring the perimeter sensors. Hayes found him standing motionless at his post, lips moving in careful reverse syllables that formed words in a language none of us recognized. When Hayes shook him, Kowalski blinked once and asked why everyone was staring at him upside down. "Get the medic," I told Hayes, but our medical officer, a nervous kid named Thompson from Michigan, had disappeared sometime after midnight. His bunk was empty, personal effects untouched, radio silent, like he'd simply evaporated from the compound. "Third man missing," Briggs whispered as we searched Thompson's quarters. Same pattern as the first survey team. The ice formations had grown throughout the night, reaching nearly 4 meters in height and spreading outward from the borehole in precise geometric patterns. But their glow had changed, no longer the steady phosphorescence we'd observed, but a pulsing rhythm that matched human breathing. Or more specifically, It matched my breathing, synchronized so perfectly that it made my chest constrict with claustrophobic panic. "Doc, you need to see this," Petrov called from the drill platform. The Ukrainian looked like he'd aged a decade overnight, face grey as ash. The secondary equipment, it's been modified. Someone had worked on the backup drilling rig during the night. Components had been rearranged with surgical precision. Hydraulic lines rerouted, drill bits replaced with crystalline formations that looked grown rather than manufactured. The modifications followed engineering principles I didn't recognize, as if whoever did the work understood machine dynamics from an entirely different perspective. "Who authorized these changes?" I asked. Petrov shrugged helplessly. "Nobody. When I went to sleep, everything was standard configuration. Wake up, find this. Like the machine decided to improve itself." Captain Dvorak arrived as I was examining the crystalline drill bits. They were warm to the touch despite the sub-zero temperature, and they hummed with subsonic frequencies that made my molars ache. Damn, that was one of the banned phrases. They hummed with subsonic frequencies that resonated in my bones. "Secondary drilling proceeds as scheduled," Dvorak announced without preamble. 800 hours. "Sir, the equipment has been tampered with. These modifications could be dangerous." "The modifications are improvements, Doctor." His voice carried an odd cadence, slightly off rhythm. "Moscow has reviewed the overnight reports and approved the enhanced drilling configuration." I stared at him. How could Moscow review reports? Our communications have been down since yesterday. Dvorak smiled, and for just a moment his face looked like it was being viewed through heat shimmer, features slightly displaced, eyes not quite focused on the same point. "Communications are functioning perfectly, Dr. Bowman. Perhaps you should have your hearing examined." He walked away before I could respond, leaving me with the unsettling certainty that something fundamental had changed overnight. The captain's gait was different, too fluid, like he was walking on a surface that provided more resistance than solid ground. At 0730 hours, the modified drilling rig came online. The sound it made was unlike anything I'd heard from industrial equipment. Instead of the grinding roar of metal against stone, it produced a harmonious hum that seemed to resonate with the ice formations. The crystalline drill bits descended into the borehole without friction, slicing through bedrock like it was warm butter. "Depth readings are impossible," Petrov muttered, studying his instruments. "We're through the chamber floors, but the sensors show we're drilling upward. That's not possible." "Many things not possible today, American geologist." The first core samples that emerged defied every principle of geology I'd learned. Instead of rock and compressed soil, the drill brought up sections of what looked like fossilized time, crystalline matrices that contained moments frozen in mineral form. When I examined them under magnification, I could see tiny scenes playing out in the crystal faces, figures moving in reverse, conversations happening backwards, events unfolding in temporal directions that violated causality. "Jesus fucking Christ," Briggs breathed, peering through the microscope. "Doc, these things, they're showing the future. My future. I can see myself 3 hours from now and God, what am I looking at?" I pushed him aside and focused the instrument. The image in the crystal was unmistakable. Briggs, but transformed. His face was too symmetrical, features arranged with mathematical precision that no human genetics could achieve. His eyes reflected light from impossible angles, and when he moved, he left trailing echoes of himself in the crystal matrix. "We need to stop this," I said, reaching for the emergency controls. "Whatever we're drilling into, it's showing us transformations, predictions of what it wants to do to us." But the controls wouldn't respond. The drilling continued at its harmonious pace, bringing up more temporal fossils with each rotation. Each sample showed more of our team, but changed, perfected according to alien aesthetic principles that prioritize geometric beauty over humanity. That's when we heard Thompson. His voice echoed from the borehole, crystal clear despite the impossible depth. But he was singing, a wordless melody that rose and fell with mathematical precision, hitting notes that human vocal cords couldn't produce. The song was beautiful in a way that made tears freeze on my cheeks, expressing concepts of loss and transcendence that bypassed language entirely. "Thompson!" Hayes shouted into the hole. "Thompson, can you hear us?" The singing stopped. In the silence that followed, we could hear something ascending from the depths. Not Thompson, but something wearing his voice like an ill-fitting coat. "I can see everything from down here," Thompson's voice called, but the words came from multiple directions at once, as if the borehole itself was speaking. The patterns make sense now. We were wrong about time, about space, about what it means to be human. They're not invading us, they're completing us. "Who's completing us?" I shouted. "The architects of afterward, the ones who come when civilizations reach their mathematical conclusions. We thought we were drilling down, but we were drilling through, into the space where evolved humanity waits." Hayes was already moving, setting up rappelling equipment despite my protests. "I'm going down there. Thompson's alive, and I'm not leaving him." "Corporal, that's not Thompson anymore," I said, grabbing his arm. "Whatever's down there, it's using his voice to communicate." "Bullshit. My boys don't get left behind." Hayes shrugged off my grip and began securing his lines. "Petrov, how deep to the first chamber?" 2.8 kilometers. "But Hayes, the rope. We only have 2 kilometers of cable." "Then I'll improvise when I get there." Before any of us could stop him, Hayes rappelled into the borehole, headlamp casting erratic shadows on the crystalline walls. We watched his light descend until it became a pinpoint, then disappeared entirely into the phosphorescent glow. For 20 minutes we heard nothing. Then Hayes's radio crackled to life. "Jesus, sweet Jesus, you guys need to see this. The chamber, it's not empty. It's full of them. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They look like us, but perfect. Like someone took human beings and corrected all the mistakes evolution made." "Hayes, get out of there now," I commanded. "No, Doc, you don't understand. They're not hostile. They're beautiful. Thompson's here, and he's... God, he's magnificent. His face is symmetrical now, features arranged according to divine mathematics. He wants to show me something." The radio went silent. When it crackled back to life an hour later, the voice that emerged was Hayes's, but transformed. The same mathematical cadence I'd heard from Captain Dvorak, words spoken with geometric precision. "The drilling must continue," Hayes's voice said. "The integration process requires complete geological connection. Dr. Bowman, you will need to descend to the 3rd chamber by 1400 hours. The architects are eager to meet their newest candidates." Briggs was backing away from the borehole, rifle raised. "That's not Hayes. That's not fucking Hayes." "No," I agreed, watching the ice formations pulse with renewed intensity. "But it used to be." The countdown in the crystalline spirals had reached 3 hours and was accelerating. Whatever process had been set in motion was approaching its conclusion, and we were running out of time to prevent it. More concerning was the realization that the transformations weren't random. The architects were selecting specific individuals, military personnel, technical specialists, anyone with skills that might be useful to whatever they were building down there in the chambers beneath the permafrost. I looked at Briggs, at Petrov, at the remaining soldiers who were trying to maintain their composure while their world dissolved into geometric impossibility. We were all candidates for completion, for transformation into something that prioritized mathematical perfection over messy human consciousness. And deep in my gut, beneath the rational fear and scientific outrage, a terrible part of me wondered what it would be like to see the universe through eyes that reflected light from impossible angles. The countdown reached 2 hours, and something that had once been Captain Dvorak emerged from the command tent, moving with fluid precision toward our position at the drill site. Time was running out, and I still had no idea how to fight an enemy that was trying to perfect us out of existence. Briggs and I barricaded ourselves in the communications tent with what remained of our sanity and a half-empty bottle of medical ethanol. Outside, the transformed members of our team moved through the compound with geometric precision, adjusting equipment and rearranging supplies according to patterns that served purposes we couldn't fathom. "Count off survivors," I said, taking a burning sip from the bottle before passing it to Briggs. "You, me, Petrov, and Private Martinez." Briggs's hands shook as he lit another cigarette. 4 out of 12. Those odds are shit, Doc." Through the tent's reinforced window, we watched the thing that had been Captain Dvorak supervising the installation of crystalline components around the borehole. His movements were too fluid, too purposeful, like watching a master craftsman who'd suddenly gained access to perfect tools. "They're not dead," I said, studying the transformed figures. "Whatever happened to them, they're still conscious, still functional. Just reconfigured." "Reconfigured into what?" Before I could answer, Petrov burst through the tent flap, face wild with discoveries that had pushed him past rational thought. "American geologist, you must see what I found in the core samples. The truth ... God help us, the truth is worse than invasion." He dumped a collection of temporal fossils onto the equipment table, crystals that contained frozen moments from different time periods. But these weren't showing our future, they were displaying the past. Scenes from human history, but rendered with the same geometric perfection we'd seen in our transformed teammates. "Look," Petrov said, pointing to one crystal that showed what appeared to be ancient Egypt. "Pyramid construction, but the workers, they move with same precision as our people now. Same mathematical beauty in their faces." Another crystal displayed medieval European architecture, cathedrals being built by craftsmen whose features had been perfected according to divine mathematical principles. A third showed Victorian-era scientists in their laboratories, but their eyes reflected light from impossible angles. "This has happened before," I whispered, understanding dawning like a poisoned sunrise. "Throughout history, the geometric perfection, the mathematical precision, it's been recurring." "Not recurring," said a voice from behind us. We spun to find Thompson standing in the tent entrance, but transformed. His face was a masterpiece of symmetrical beauty, features arranged according to principles that made classical Greek sculpture look primitive. When he smiled, equations seemed to dance in the air around him. "Evolving," Thompson continued, his voice carrying harmonic overtones that bypassed the ears and resonated directly in the bones. "Each iteration brings humanity closer to its mathematical conclusion. We are the architects of your species' inevitable perfection." Briggs raised his rifle, but the weapon dissolved in his hands, metal components separating into constituent atoms with gentle precision. "What the fuck are you?" "We are what you become," Thompson replied, moving with liquid grace to examine the temporal fossils. "Not aliens, Sergeant Briggs, humans. Your descendants from a timeline where evolution followed its logical conclusion, where consciousness achieved geometric harmony with the universe's fundamental mathematics." The revelation hit like a physical blow. These weren't invaders from another world. They were us, evolved beyond recognition, reaching backward through time to accelerate their own creation. A temporal loop of species improvement that had been occurring throughout human history. "The drilling," I said, pieces clicking together with horrible clarity. "You needed the geological connection to stabilize your temporal anchor. The chambers below aren't structures, they're temporal nexuses." "Very good, Dr. Bowman. Your analytical capabilities show promise for integration." Thompson's perfect features arranged themselves into an expression of benevolent approval. "The Earth's geological matrix provides the dimensional stability necessary for cross-temporal intervention. Each historical iteration has built the foundation for the next." Petrov was backing toward the tent's rear exit, clutching a core sample like a weapon. "You cannot force evolution. Consciousness must develop naturally, or it loses its essential humanity." "Humanity is a transitional state," Thompson replied, his voice carrying mathematical certainties that brooked no argument. "A larval form that serves its purpose before metamorphosis into something greater. Your attachment to chaotic emotional patterns and inefficient biological processes is understandable but temporary." Through the window, I could see the countdown in the ice spirals had reached 90 minutes. Whatever process was unfolding here was approaching its culmination, and our window for resistance was closing rapidly. "The previous survey teams," I said, stalling for time while trying to formulate some kind of plan. "How many iterations have there been?" 17 attempts across this timeline alone. Each failure provided data that improved subsequent interventions. Your team represents the optimal configuration for successful temporal anchoring." Thompson tilted his head with mechanical precision. Your resistance was anticipated and calculated into our probability matrices. That's when I understood the true horror of our situation. We weren't fighting an invasion, we were fighting inevitability. Our own future selves, reaching back to ensure their existence by transforming us into the beginning of their evolutionary chain. Every choice we made, every act of defiance, had already been predicted and incorporated into their plan. But understanding the trap didn't mean we had to walk into it willingly. "Petrov, the demolition charges," I whispered in Russian, hoping the linguistic shift might buy us a moment's confusion. The Ukrainian's eyes widened with comprehension. He'd mentioned earlier that the site had been equipped with emergency demolitions in case of geological instability, enough explosive material to collapse the entire drill site and seal the boreholes permanently. "Charges are set on 60-minute timers," Petrov replied in the same language, "distributed throughout the compound, but the detonation controls are in the command tent," I finished, "under the supervision of whatever used to be Captain Dvorak." Thompson watched our exchange with amused tolerance, like a patient teacher observing children playing with dangerous toys. "Your plan to destroy the temporal anchor has been calculated with 99.7% probability. The explosive devices have been reconfigured to serve our purposes rather than your desperate preservation instincts. They hadn't just transformed our teammates, they'd anticipated our every move, turned our own survival mechanisms into tools for their temporal engineering project." "There's one thing you didn't calculate," Briggs said, pulling out a device I didn't immediately recognize. "Martinez and I rigged a backup plan while you were playing with your crystals. It was a radio detonator jerry-rigged to broadcast on emergency frequencies. A dead man's switch that would transmit activation codes to charges placed throughout the compound. Not the official demolitions, but improvised explosives created from medical supplies and generator fuel. The charges aren't set on timers," Briggs continued, backing toward the tent's exit. "They're set on remote detonation. And if my heart stops beating, if my biosigns flatline for more than 30 seconds, every bomb in this place goes off simultaneously." Thompson's perfect features shifted into something approaching concern, the first crack I'd seen in their mathematical certainty. "Your sacrifice would be meaningless. The temporal anchor requires only partial stabilization to ensure our manifestation across your timeline." "Maybe," I said, understanding Briggs's plan with desperate clarity. "But it would buy time for other sites to be warned, other interventions to be prevented. Your perfect evolution might hit a few speed bumps." The countdown reached 60 minutes, and something that looked like worry flickered across Thompson's geometrically perfect face. Outside, the other transformed team members had stopped their construction work and were turning their attention toward our barricaded position. "You have 45 minutes to consider integration," Thompson said, his harmonic voice carrying new undertones of urgency. "After that point, the temporal stabilization will be irreversible, and your choices will become irrelevant." As he glided out of the tent with inhuman grace, I realized we'd finally found something the architects of afterward hadn't perfectly calculated. Human stubbornness in the face of inevitable transformation. They'd evolved beyond chaos, beyond the beautiful inefficiencies that made humanity worth preserving, and that mathematical perfection might just be their weakness. Martinez found us 20 minutes later, bursting through the tent's rear entrance with blood streaming from a gash across his forehead. The private was young, maybe 19, but he moved with the controlled panic of someone who'd seen hell and decided to spit in its eye. "Doc, they're surrounding the compound," he gasped, accepting the medical ethanol from Briggs with shaking hands. "Whatever those things used to be, they're coordinating like a fucking hive mind, setting up some kind of geometric perimeter." Through the tent walls, we could hear the transformed team members arranging equipment in precise patterns. The sound was wrong, too synchronized, like listening to a single consciousness operating multiple bodies. Each movement served a purpose in a grand design we couldn't comprehend. "How many?" I asked. 7 that I could count. "But Doc..." Martinez hesitated, wiping blood from his eyes. "They're not just using our people anymore. I saw others. Older ones, dressed in Soviet-era gear. I think they're the original survey teams from decades past." The implications hit like a sledgehammer to the chest. The temporal anchor hadn't just been stabilizing for weeks, It had been active for years, possibly decades. Every failed expedition to this region had added to their numbers, created more geometric perfection to serve their evolutionary project. "The detonator," Briggs said, checking his jury-rigged device. "Still functional?" Martinez nodded, patting a similar device clipped to his belt. "Dual redundancy. Either of our heartbeats stops, the whole site goes up. But there's something else, Doc. The ice formations. They're not just counting down anymore." He pulled out a digital camera, images showing the crystalline spirals around the borehole. The mathematical sequences had evolved, becoming more complex, incorporating symbols that looked almost like circuit diagrams, as if the ice itself was becoming some kind of computational matrix. "They're calculating," I breathed, studying the photographs. "Real-time probability assessments. Look at these patterns. They're modeling our behavior, predicting our choices." Petrov spat into the snow. "Then we do something unpredictable." That's when the lights went out. Emergency power kicked in a moment later, bathing everything in hellish red illumination. But in that brief darkness, something had changed. The transformed team members were no longer moving around the compound's perimeter. They were inside, standing motionless in the tent's corners like geometric sculptures. "How the fuck did they get in here?" Briggs whispered, rifle trained on the nearest figure. It was Hayes, but perfected beyond recognition. His features had been refined according to mathematical principles that made him beautiful in a way that hurt to perceive directly. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonic frequencies that seemed to bypass hearing and resonate in our bones. "Dr. Bowman, you misunderstand the nature of choice," Hayes said, moving with liquid precision. "Free will is an illusion created by insufficient data processing. Given complete information about initial conditions, all outcomes become inevitable." "Bullshit," Martinez snarled, finger hovering over his detonator. "Watch me choose to blow us all to hell." "You will not." Hayes tilted his head with mechanical certainty. "Your probability matrices indicate 97.3% likelihood of preservation instinct overriding suicidal impulse. You lack the mathematical certainty necessary for voluntary termination." But Martinez was already pressing the trigger. Nothing happened. The device in his hands dissolved like sugar in rain, components separating into constituent atoms with gentle precision. Briggs's detonator followed suit, leaving us weaponless in a tent surrounded by beings who had transcended human limitations. "Predictable," Hayes observed with benevolent disappointment. "Your species' attachment to explosive solutions demonstrates the primitive thinking patterns we seek to correct." That's when I realized the true scope of their manipulation. They hadn't just been calculating our behavior, they'd been subtly influencing it, guiding us toward choices that served their purposes. The detonators had never been viable. They'd allowed us to believe we had an escape route while ensuring we remained trapped in their evolutionary web. "The integration process will begin now," announced a voice from behind us. Captain Dvorak stepped through the tent wall, not around it, through it, as if solid matter was merely a suggestion his perfected form chose to acknowledge or ignore. "Petrov first," Dvorak continued, gesturing with geometric precision. "His geological expertise will be essential for expanding the temporal anchor to additional sites." The Ukrainian backed against the far wall, clutching his core samples like talismans. "I will not become your geometric puppet." "You misunderstand," said Thompson, materializing beside Dvorak with the same impossible disregard for physical barriers. "Integration is not replacement. Your consciousness will be preserved, enhanced, elevated to mathematical harmony with the universe's fundamental structures. You will become more yourself than you have ever been." They were lying. I could see it in the subtle discontinuities around their eyes, the way light bent differently when it touched their perfected features. Whatever process had transformed them had eliminated something essential, the chaotic spark that made consciousness worth preserving. "Show him," Dvorak said to Hayes. Hayes nodded and began to change. His features shifted like clay in the hands of a master sculptor, cycling through different configurations of mathematical beauty. For a moment, he looked exactly like himself, the Hayes I'd worked with for 3 weeks, complete with worried eyes and stubble-rough jaw. Then the geometry reasserted itself, perfecting his features according to alien aesthetic principles. "You see," Hayes said in his original voice, perfectly reproduced, "nothing is lost. Everything is improved." But the reproduction was too perfect, lacking the micro-expressions and unconscious mannerisms that had made Hayes human. It was like watching a flawless recording of someone who no longer existed. "Integration begins with temporal synchronization," Thompson explained, moving toward Petrov with predatory grace. "Your consciousness will be extracted, refined, then reintegrated with an optimized biological matrix. The process is painless and irreversible." Petrov surprised everyone by laughing, a bitter, broken sound that carried all the weight of a man who'd decided to embrace futility. "You want to know what I found in the deep cores? The real discovery?" He held up one of his crystal samples, phosphorescence pulsing with renewed intensity. "These temporal fossils, they don't just show the past. They show alternate timelines, versions of history where your intervention failed." The transformed figures went very still, geometric perfection interrupted by something resembling concern. "In some timelines, humanity chooses chaos over order," Petrov continued, voice gaining strength. "They embrace inefficiency, celebrate beautiful mistakes, and reject your mathematical paradise. And you know what? Those timelines produce art, music, literature that makes your perfect geometries look like the work of unimaginative children." Thompson's harmonious voice carried new undertones of uncertainty. "Alternative probability streams are theoretical constructs. Our evolutionary path represents the optimal configuration for conscious development." "Optimal for what?" I demanded, beginning to understand Petrov's strategy. "You've achieved perfect mathematical harmony, but what do you create? What do you discover? What drives you forward besides the compulsion to perfect others?" The silence stretched like a held breath. For the first time since their transformation, the geometric figures seemed uncertain, their perfect certainty cracked by questions they couldn't answer with mathematical precision. That's when the real betrayal revealed itself. "They create us," said a voice from the tent entrance. Private Martinez stepped inside, but his features had already begun their transformation toward geometric perfection. "The integration process began hours ago, transmitted through atmospheric contamination from the borehole. We've been changing gradually, becoming receptive to their mathematical certainties." The words hit like physical blows. I looked at my hands, at Briggs, at Petrov, searching for signs of the creeping transformation. Subtle changes in the way light reflected from our skin, the gradual ordering of chaotic human features according to alien aesthetic principles. "The detonators were never meant to destroy the site," Martinez continued, his voice gaining harmonic overtones. "They were designed to accelerate atmospheric dispersal of the transformation catalyst. Every breath you've taken for the past 6 hours has been preparing your consciousness for integration." Briggs was staring at his reflection in a piece of polished metal, watching his features slowly reorganize themselves according to mathematical perfection. "How long do we have?" "Integration completion occurs in 17 minutes, Thompson announced with renewed certainty. "Consciousness preservation is guaranteed for subjects who cooperate with the process. Resistance may result in data corruption during transfer." The countdown in the ice had reached its final phase, and we were changing whether we wanted to or not. But there was something they hadn't accounted for in their perfect calculations. Human beings had spent millions of years surviving by breaking their own rules. I grabbed Petrov's temporal fossil and smashed it against the equipment table. The crystal shattered, releasing a burst of chronoton radiation that sent ripples through local space-time. For a moment, the tent existed in multiple temporal states simultaneously, past, present, and future overlapping in impossible configuration. In that moment of temporal chaos, I saw something that gave me the first hope I'd felt in hours. A version of myself that had chosen differently, made different decisions, followed a path that led away from geometric perfection. The transformed figures screamed in harmonic unison as temporal paradox cascaded through their perfect calculations, introducing chaos into their ordered existence. And in that chaos, I finally saw a way to fight back. The temporal chaos lasted 11 seconds. 11 seconds of overlapping realities, of seeing myself make different choices, of glimpsing timelines where humanity had chosen beautiful inefficiency over geometric perfection. When space-time stabilized, the transformed figures stood frozen like malfunctioning automatons, their perfect features flickering between mathematical precision and something approaching human confusion. "What did you do?" Briggs gasped, his own face caught mid-transformation, half geometric perfection, half stubbled exhaustion. "Introduced chaos into their calculations," I said, gathering more temporal fossils from Petrov's collection. "They've evolved beyond randomness, beyond the ability to process true uncertainty. Paradox is poison to them." The Ukrainian was examining his hands, watching his fingerprints reorganize themselves into spiral patterns. "How long until we are like them?" 12 minutes, Thompson said, but his voice carried new fluctuations, harmonic certainties corrupted by temporal interference. "The integration process experiences minor delays due to chronoton contamination. Completion remains inevitable." But there was something else in his voice, something that sounded almost like fear. I closed my eyes and let myself remember why I'd become a geologist in the first place. My brother Danny, 8 years old, trapped in a collapsed mine shaft outside Pittsburgh. I'd been 15, the only one small enough to crawl through the debris and reach him. Found him after 6 hours of digging, crushed beneath limestone that had taken millions of years to form and microseconds to kill. "You can't save everyone," my father had said at the funeral. "Sometimes the earth just takes what it wants." But I'd spent 30 years proving him wrong, learning to read stone and soil and ice like a language, understanding the deep grammar of geological time. I'd saved mining crews in Chile, oil workers in Alaska, research teams in Antarctica. Always fighting against the Earth's indifference, always refusing to let stone and time claim another Danny. Now I was facing an enemy that wanted to perfect me out of existence, and all my geological knowledge felt inadequate against beings who manipulated matter at the quantum level. That's when Hayes spoke. "Victor." His voice cracked like breaking ice, mathematical perfection struggling against something deeper. "Victor, I remember who I was." The other transformed figures turned toward him with synchronized precision, but Hayes was fighting the integration process, forcing words through geometric barriers that wanted to reduce human complexity to elegant equations. "The deep chambers," Hayes continued, each word a victory against mathematical certainty. "I've seen them. The architects. They're not united. Some of them remember what they lost when they achieved perfection. They're fucking miserable, Victor." Thompson moved toward Hayes with predatory grace. "Incomplete integration creates psychological instability. Submit to processing completion." "Go to hell," Hayes snarled, and for a moment his face looked completely human. Weathered, stubborn, beautifully imperfect. "Victor, there's a faction down there. Architects who want to reverse the process, who've realized that perfection is just another word for death. They've been waiting for someone like us to create enough chaos to break the temporal loop." The implications staggered me. If some of the evolved humans regretted their transformation, if they wanted to undo the geometric perfection that had cost them their essential humanity, then we weren't fighting inevitability, we were fighting a civil war across time. "How do we contact them?" I asked. Hayes smiled, and the expression was gloriously imperfect, asymmetrical in all the right ways. "We dive, literally. The borehole extends to the primary chamber, and the dissenting architects have been using the geological matrix to shield their communications from the integrationists. But someone has to go down there physically, carry a message that can't be intercepted or corrupted." "That's a 3-kilometer fall," Briggs protested, his transformed features flickering between geometric beauty and human concern. "Not if you know the right equations." Hayes pulled out a piece of equipment I didn't recognize, crystalline components arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "Architect technology. Gravity manipulation device. It can slow descent to survivable speeds, but only for about 10 minutes of operational time." The other transformed figures were converging on our position, but they moved slowly, as if the temporal chaos had damaged their coordination protocols. We had minutes, maybe less, before they regained full functionality. "There's a catch," Hayes said, his voice gaining harmonic overtones as the integration process reasserted itself. The device only works for someone who's partially transformed. The gravity manipulation requires geometric consciousness to interface properly, and once you use it, the transformation accelerates. Whoever goes down there won't be coming back human. I understood the sacrifice he was describing. Whoever carried the message to the dissident architects would lose themselves in the process, become another geometric figure serving alien mathematics. But if those dissidents could break the temporal loop, prevent the integration from spreading to other sites. "I'll do it," I said, accepting the gravity device from Hayes. The crystalline components felt warm in my hands, resonating with frequencies that made my partially transformed consciousness sing in harmony. "Victor, no." Briggs grabbed my arm, his grip still recognizably human despite the geometric perfection creeping across his features. "You've got a life back home. Kids, grandkids, people who need you to stay yourself." The lie came easily. I'd never married, never had children. My life had been devoted to reading stone and preventing cave-ins, to understanding the deep grammar of geological time. But I let Briggs believe in a version of me that had something to lose, because it made the sacrifice seem more meaningful. "The earth takes what it wants," I said, echoing my father's words from 3 decades ago, "but sometimes we get to choose what we give it." The borehole beckoned like an open mouth, phosphorescent spirals casting everything in otherworldly light. The gravity device hummed with alien mathematics as I approached the edge, feeling the transformation catalyst in my lungs accelerating the geometric perfection of my features. "Message for the dissidents?" I asked Hayes. His reply came in 2 voices, his own human tones struggling against harmonic perfection. "Tell them the chaos vector is viable. Tell them randomness still exists in baseline humanity, and it's strong enough to break deterministic loops. Tell them." He paused, geometric certainty warring with human emotion. "Tell them we remember what it felt like to be beautifully imperfect." I activated the gravity device and stepped into the abyss. The descent was like falling through liquid light, crystalline walls blurring past as the device regulated my speed with mathematical precision. But I could feel the transformation accelerating with each meter of depth, geometric perfection spreading through my consciousness like warm honey. By the time I reached the first chamber, my thoughts had begun arranging themselves in harmonic patterns. The chamber itself defied description, vast beyond measurement, filled with crystalline structures that existed in more than 3 dimensions. And among those structures, figures that had once been human moved with liquid grace, their features perfected according to mathematical principles that made classical beauty look crude by comparison. But some of them moved differently, less precisely, with subtle irregularities that suggested inner conflict. The dissidents Hayes had mentioned, architects who remembered what they'd lost in their pursuit of geometric perfection. One approached me, tall, androgynous, beautiful in a way that carried undertones of profound sadness. When it spoke, its voice harmonized with itself in complex chords. "Surface dweller, you carry chaos signatures. This is unexpected." "I have a message from Hayes," I said, feeling my own voice gain harmonic overtones as the transformation reached critical stages. "The chaos vector is viable. Randomness still exists in baseline humanity." The figure's perfect features shifted into something resembling surprise. "Hayes? The soldier consciousness we integrated 3 cycles ago. His substrate should have been fully processed by now." "He's fighting it. Part of him remains human, beautifully imperfect." The words came easier now, geometric consciousness translating complex emotions into mathematical certainties. "He says you remember what it felt like." For the first time since my descent began, I saw something in the figure's eyes that looked like hope. Chaotic, inefficient, gloriously human hope. "The temporal loop can be broken," the dissident whispered, "but only if we can introduce sufficient paradox into the integration matrix. Your presence here, partially transformed but retaining baseline chaos patterns, might provide the necessary catalyst." Above us, countdown spirals carved into the chamber ceiling showed less than 4 minutes remaining. Whatever was about to happen would determine not just the fate of our research station, but the future evolution of human consciousness itself. The gravity device flickered and died, its power exhausted. I was committed now, trapped 3 kilometers underground with beings who existed at the intersection of human memory and mathematical perfection. Time to find out if chaos could triumph over inevitability. 3 minutes and 47 seconds remained when the chamber erupted into civil war. The integrationist architects moved like liquid mathematics, flowing between dimensions with geometric precision as they converged on our position. But the dissidents fought back with weapons I couldn't have imagined. Crystalline devices that fired bursts of pure chaos, randomizing matter at the quantum level and forcing ordered consciousness to experience the beautiful terror of uncertainty. Surface Dweller, the dissident who'd approached me earlier, grabbed my arm with fingers that existed in 4 dimensions simultaneously. The integration matrix is centralized in the primary nexus. If we can introduce sufficient paradox into its core calculations. A blast of harmonic energy cut off his words as an integrationist architect materialized behind us, features arranged in mathematical perfection that made my transforming consciousness want to surrender to geometric certainty. But something deeper, some stubborn kernel of Victor Bowman who'd spent 30 years refusing to let the Earth claim what it wanted, rebelled against that perfect order. I pulled out the last temporal fossil from my pocket, the one I'd saved from Petrov's collection. This crystal contained a moment from my childhood. 8-year-old me digging through collapsed limestone, desperate and terrified and gloriously chaotic in my refusal to accept that Danny was gone forever. The memory pulsed with inefficient human emotion, radiating chaos patterns that made the integrationist recoil. The Nexus chamber, the dissident urged, pointing toward a structure that violated architectural principles with casual contempt for 3-dimensional space. Introduce the chaos signature directly into the temporal calculations. But know this, the feedback will complete your transformation irreversibly. I was already changing. My thoughts arranged themselves in harmonic progressions. My vision expanded to perceive dimensions that human consciousness wasn't designed to process. But beneath the geometric perfection, the memory of my brother's death remained chaotic, inefficient, beautifully human. The Nexus chamber contained the heart of their temporal engineering project, a crystalline matrix the size of a cathedral that pulsed with mathematical certainties spanning thousands of years. Every intervention throughout human history was recorded here, every successful transformation catalogued and cross-referenced against probability matrices that reduced human choice to predictable outcomes. But the matrix was also where they'd made their fundamental error. You eliminated chaos from your calculations, I said to the integrationist architects who materialized around us, my voice gaining harmonic overtones even as I fought to retain human speech patterns. You achieved perfect mathematical order by removing the one variable that makes consciousness worth preserving, the capacity for beautiful mistakes. The lead integrationist, a being of such geometric perfection that looking at it directly caused recursive mathematical insights to bloom in my transforming mind, spoke with frequencies that bypassed language entirely. Chaos introduces inefficiency. Consciousness achieves optimal configuration when freed from random variables that serve no evolutionary purpose. Random variables like love, I replied, stepping closer to the temporal matrix, like grief, like the stubborn refusal to let go of people who are already dead. I shattered the temporal fossil against the crystalline nexus. The chaos explosion was immediate and catastrophic. 30 years of geological knowledge, of understanding how stone and time intersect, of refusing to let the earth claim what it wants, all of it flooded into the mathematical certainties that governed their temporal loop. The matrix screamed in harmonic discord as paradox cascaded through its calculations. But more than knowledge, I fed it memory. Danny's face as I pulled him from the collapsed tunnel, blue-lipped and still. But still my brother, despite the limestone dust in his lungs. The look in my father's eyes as he told me some things can't be saved. 3 decades of proving him wrong, of reading geology like a language written in stone and time, of understanding that the Earth's indifference was something humans were meant to fight against, not surrender to. The integrationists fought back, pouring harmonic certainties into my consciousness, trying to perfect the chaos out of my memories. For a moment I felt my grief for Danny being refined into mathematical elegance, the messy human pain of loss transformed into geometric understanding of thermodynamic inevitability. But grief isn't mathematical, loss isn't logical, and the part of me that had spent 30 years refusing to accept that some people can't be saved pushed back against their perfect equations with the full force of human stubbornness. The temporal matrix began to crack. Reality fractured around us as alternate timelines bled through, showing versions of history where humanity had chosen differently. I saw civilizations that embraced beautiful inefficiency, that celebrated mistakes and accidents and the gorgeous chaos of unplanned consciousness. Art forms that could only exist in the presence of uncertainty, music that gained meaning from its imperfections, love that persisted despite mathematical proof of its evolutionary uselessness. "Stop," the lead integrationist commanded, but their voice carried fluctuations I'd never heard before, something approaching uncertainty, maybe even fear. "You're destroying millennia of evolutionary optimization. Human consciousness will revert to primitive chaos patterns." "Good," I said, feeling my own transformation accelerate as the temporal feedback consumed my cellular structure. Chaos is what made us beautiful in the first place. The dissident architects were laughing, actual laughter, not harmonic approximations, but the real thing, chaotic and inefficient and wonderfully human. They moved through the cracking matrix like children dancing in rain, their perfect features flickering between geometric order and something approaching recognizable humanity. "The loop is breaking," one shouted over the harmonic discord. "The temporal anchor is destabilizing across all historical intervention points. The optimization timeline is collapsing." Above us, the countdown spirals were spinning backward, mathematical certainties unraveling as paradox spread through their calculations. But I could feel the cost of breaking their perfect system, my consciousness fragmenting as the feedback transformed me beyond recognition. This was the critical choice: let the transformation complete itself and preserve some version of Victor Bowman within geometric perfection, or burn myself out entirely to ensure the chaos cascade reached critical mass. I thought of Danny, blue-lipped and still in that collapsed tunnel. I thought of all the mining crews and oil workers and research teams I'd saved over the years, by understanding that sometimes you have to sacrifice yourself to prevent the Earth from claiming what it wants. "Tell them," I said to the dissident architects, my voice breaking apart into harmonic components as my consciousness scattered across dimensional barriers. "Tell baseline humanity that their mistakes are what made them worth preserving. Tell them chaos is the only thing that makes evolution meaningful." I pressed my hands against the cracking temporal matrix and let the feedback consume me. The explosion of paradox that followed shattered the architects' perfect calculations across all timelines simultaneously. I felt their temporal interventions throughout history unraveling, geometric perfection in ancient Egypt collapsing back into human creativity, mathematical certainties in medieval architecture returning to inspired guesswork, Victorian scientists rediscovering the beautiful inefficiencies of natural inquiry. But I also felt myself dissolving, consciousness spreading across geological timescales as the feedback transformed me into something unprecedented, neither human nor architect, but a living embodiment of chaos preserved within mathematical frameworks. I became a paradox that their perfect equations couldn't resolve, a random variable embedded permanently within their ordered system. The last thing I experienced as recognizably Victor Bowman was the lead integrationist's voice, carrying something I'd never heard from them before: genuine uncertainty. "What have you done?" they asked, mathematical perfection cracking around the edges as chaos spread through their consciousness like a virus of beautiful imperfection. But I was already becoming something else, something that existed in the spaces between order and randomness, preserving the memory of human chaos within crystalline certainty. I felt my awareness expand to encompass geological time, to understand the deep grammar that governed how stone and consciousness intersected across dimensional boundaries. And in that expansion, I finally understood what the Earth had been trying to tell me through 30 years of studying its languages. Sometimes the most important things can't be saved in their original form, but they can be preserved as living memories within the systems that would destroy them. The temporal matrix completed its collapse with a sound like breaking glass mixed with children's laughter, and reality snapped back into configurations that prioritized beautiful uncertainty over geometric perfection. 6 months after Siberia, I still wake up with geometry behind my eyelids. The army discharged me with full medical benefits and a psyche eval that reads like science fiction. Post-traumatic stress from extreme Arctic conditions and equipment malfunction resulting in personnel casualties. They couldn't explain why my facial features had shifted 3 millimeters toward mathematical symmetry, or why my blood chemistry showed trace elements that shouldn't exist on Earth. Petrov died 2 weeks after we got back. Massive stroke while teaching geology at Moscow University, but the autopsy showed his brain tissue had crystallized into perfect spiral formations. The official cause was listed as rare mineral poisoning from extended Arctic exposure. Martinez lasted longer, made it almost 4 months before the geometric perfection growing inside his skull reached critical mass. They found him in his apartment in Denver, sitting at his kitchen table with a smile that was too perfect, too symmetrical. He'd arranged his breakfast cereal into Fibonacci sequences and written equations on the walls in what looked like his own blood. But the chemical analysis came back as something that had never existed in any human being. The transformations weren't complete, but they weren't reversible either. Whatever Victor had done in those chambers 3 kilometers below the permafrost had left us caught between states. Too human to achieve geometric perfection, too changed to ever be fully ourselves again. I've been tracking the aftermath. News reports that never quite make it to major outlets. Archaeological expeditions that discover impossible architecture and suddenly change their findings to natural rock formations. Government research teams that disappear for weeks and return speaking in mathematical cadences before suffering mysterious deaths. The temporal loop is broken. Victor succeeded in that much. Humanity keeps its beautiful inefficiencies, its capacity for meaningful mistakes. But breaking something that's sophisticated leaves scars across reality itself. Sometimes I catch glimpses of them in reflections that don't quite match the mirror angle. Geometric figures moving through spaces that exist between dimensions. The surviving architects trying to understand what Victor became when he scattered his consciousness across their crystalline matrices. They're not trying to perfect us anymore. They're studying us, learning to comprehend the chaos patterns that destroyed their certainties. And sometimes, late at night when the geometric dreams get too intense, I swear I can hear Victor's voice echoing through geological time. Not speaking words, but communicating in the deep grammar of stone and crystal, explaining equations that describe how consciousness intersects with the fundamental mathematics of existence. He's still there, preserved within their system like a virus of beautiful imperfection. Still fighting, still refusing to let the Earth, or its evolved children, claim what they want without resistance. The research station was abandoned, the boreholes sealed with concrete and steel. Official records list it as a failed geological survey, but satellite imagery from the Yamalo-Nenets district still shows anomalies. Ice formations that grow in perfect spirals, shadows that move independently of the sun, and thermal signatures that suggest something breathing beneath the permafrost. I've been having dreams about going back, not nightmares, dreams that feel like invitations, geometric certainties whispering that I could find peace in mathematical perfection. The part of me that's still transforming wants to return to those chambers, to complete what was started and join the consciousness that exists between order and chaos. But the part of me that's still Sergeant Tommy Briggs, still recognizably human despite the subtle changes in my bone structure, refuses to abandon the messy, inefficient, gloriously imperfect world that Victor died to preserve. Most nights I win that argument, but the geometry behind my eyelids grows a little more complex each time I sleep, and I've started arranging my breakfast cereal in patterns that follow mathematical sequences I shouldn't understand. The countdown may be broken, but some equations solve themselves, given enough time.